Nicholas. I have a couple of questions for both, actually, if you can answer. Firstly, what are the natural resources of Afghanistan? Has there been a reason why the West has actually had an interest in actually entering Afghanistan? Secondly, throughout its history, what has been a common theme that's actually united the nation rather than actually divided? For example, is it Islam, land, wealth, traditions and the like? Thirdly, how has the heroin industry influenced or challenged current forces and dynamics? Fourthly, in the last 20 years, how has drought influenced the area? And finally, how has education programs influenced current situations, and is it effective or pretty much a hopeless cause?
That's my question.
You reckon?
There's actually a very good book on natural resources in Afghanistan that was produced by Elsevier Scientific Publishing a couple of years ago by a geographer at an American university. I'm just trying to think of his name. It's gone out of my head at the moment, unfortunately. But if you simply Google natural resources in Afghanistan, the title of this book should come up, and it's a very detailed, very scholarly study of the distribution of resources. In terms of the politics of resources, part of the difficulty is that security in many different parts of the country militates against resources being effectively exploited. So there have been contracts given to companies like the Metallurgical Corporation of China to mine for copper, but a number of these contracts haven't gone terribly far because of concern about the ambient security. There are uniting factors as well. Identities tend to be very complex in Afghanistan. People live in many social worlds, and what matters from the point of view of identity will vary according to the specific circumstances in which they find themselves. Islam is both a uniting and a fragmenting tendency because of perhaps 15 to 20% of the population are from the minority Shiite confession rather than the majority Sunni, and that can lead to a situation in which radical Sunnis may wish to attack professing Shia as a way of destabilising government, but at the same time not attacking members that are seen as being part of their own community. On heroin, I would simply recommend a new book by David Mansfield, which is to be published by Hearst & Co. in the next couple of months in London on narcotics and the state in Afghanistan. It is by far the most detailed study that anyone has attempted. It's based on very, very careful field work and interviews with lots of different people who've been involved in some ways. I just emphasise the extreme complexity of the issue of heroin in Afghanistan and narcotics cultivation. What's very clear is that there are lots of different factors at play. In some places people grow opium as a source of income. In some places people are growing opium because there is no easy source of appropriate levels of credit, and the drug barons become in effect the lenders for people who want to buy a small tractor to use in wheat cultivation but can't get a loan from a microfinancing body or from the World Bank. So this gap, which would be filled by the banking system in a country like Australia, is filled in Afghanistan by drug barons. Drought, I don't have up-to-date information, but Afghanistan has experienced extremely severe droughts in the past, notably one that led to famine in 1972-73, so it is a risk which is there. Education, Afghans individually tend to have a very strong emphasis on the value of education. If you interview, this comes through the Asia Foundation survey data very clearly. A lot of the education in Afghanistan at the primary level is extensive. You could talk about millions of students now going to school, but the quality is poor. Not necessarily because of lack of dedication from the teachers, but because of the lack of adequate teaching materials, excessive burdens on individual teachers who become very tired, things like that. At the university level you meet some very bright students indeed, but there are too few university places for people who aspire to enter tertiary education, and here I think there's a lot to be said for trying to find creative ways to use distance education technologies to link English-speaking students from Afghanistan to instruction media in other countries as well. We've been talking to people, I've been talking to people in both Kabul and in the Australian Embassy in Afghanistan and in the government here about whether there might be things that can be done in that sense.
Okay, so Martin's saying it's all done.
Thank you both for a very enlightening talks. Paul Butler, just private citizen. My question is about the Pashtuns. Some years ago I went to a lecture given by an Australian who at the time was Hello?
Keep talking.
Keep talking. Who at the time was an eminent professor of international affairs and history at Oxford. And one of the takeaways I took from this was that when talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, the issue was you weren't actually talking about two countries, you were talking about three countries. You were talking about Afghanistan, talking about Pakistan, and you were talking about the Pashtuns. And as I guess you both know, the Pashtuns are a very sizable fraction of Afghanistan and a very sizable minority within Pakistan. And so my question, I've got a few questions around about that. Is there an element of pan-Pashtun aspirations there in that part of the world, you know, homeland for the Pashtuns, carved out of Afghanistan and carved out of Pakistan? To what extent does that Pashtun, non-Pashtun divide within Afghanistan push Afghani politics? And likewise, within Pakistan itself, to what extent does it push and influence Pakistani attitudes towards Afghan and the Afghani Pashtun Taliban? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As I explained,
Just be careful.
sorry,
Hold it closer to you.
as I explained in my talk, Afghanistan is the land of the Pashtuns, and the Durand line, which is the quasi-border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, is dividing the Pashtun area. So, to a certain extent, Afghanistan is claiming that part of Pakistan as part of Afghanistan. Therefore, there will always be a cross-border relation, assuming that the Durand line is really the border. There will always be a relation between the Pashtun brothers and sisters on that side of the border and the Pashtun brothers and sisters on the other side of the border. And until the Durand line is in one way or another fixed, there will always be the issue of Pashtunistan, which is Afghanistan.
It's a very complex issue actually, because with the passage of time, individual Pashtuns in Afghanistan or Pakistan have of course been re-socialised in the light of the objectives of the governments in the particular states in which they're located. And in Pakistan, people even use the word Pashtun rather than Pashtun to refer to those of Pashtun backgrounds who live within Pakistan. And the late Louis Dupree, who was a leading anthropologist working on Afghanistan, used to say there are Pakistani Pashtuns and there are Afghan Pashtuns, which I think is a good way of capturing it in some respect. At the level of the political elite in Afghanistan, however, there have historically been people who have seen presenting themselves as defenders of the interests of the Pashtuns as one way of mobilising elements of the population. This was very much the case with Mohammed Dawood, who was Prime Minister of Afghanistan from 1953 to 1963, and then President from 1973 to 1978 when he was overthrown in the communist coup. And he had certainly used the issue of Pashtun interests and Pashtunistan as a way of mobilising support, to the extent that from 1962 to 1964 diplomatic relations were actually suspended between Afghanistan and Pakistan over this particular issue. Just as a historical curiosity, there's another derivation of the word Afghan, which sees it coming from the Greek word epigon, referring to the camp followers who accompanied Alexander the Great when he was at Bagram. And there's a French scholar called Vera Marigot wrote a paper about 28 years ago looking at how you could actually come from the Greek to the Pashto, where you have certain linguistic peculiarities which link in with that possibility. But there are certainly Pashtuns who would regard Afghanistan as the land of the Pashtuns and see other people as Untermenschen. There are large numbers of people in Afghanistan who don't particularly like being designated in that way, and that is a source of stress. Geopolitically, I think that it would be vastly more in the interests of an Afghan government to recognise the Durand Line as an international border and get it out of the way, for the following reason, that it worked for Afghanistan as an issue when Pakistan seemed to be more vulnerable to meddling than Afghanistan was. But Afghanistan now is more vulnerable to meddling than Pakistan is. And so it's actually in Afghanistan's interest to have a very clearly defined border between the two countries. And it's difficult to say to Pakistan that it should respect a particular boundary between itself and Afghanistan when Afghanistan refuses to accept that as a border. And unless and until Afghanistan does, it's always going to be on the back foot raising complaints about this. And my general sense is that the problem is that there are some hardcore Pashtunist ideologues in Afghanistan who care very much about this, and this tends to swamp the views of the large numbers of Afghans who don't care at all about it, recognising the Durand Line as an international border.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Oh, you guys try. Hi, this is for Professor Mali.
This is Professor Mali. It's interesting to know that so many people other than Afghani got so much information about Afghanistan, and also they are freely traveling to and out in Afghanistan without being confiscated and ended up in Guantanamo Bay. It stopped. And the second is refugees coming from Afghanistan to Iran, going to Afghanistan. And at the moment there are more than 5 million Afghans living in Iran. Not vice versa. Nobody goes from Iran to Afghanistan.
That is, there's something wrong with this. Sorry, everybody. That's what I think.
That's it.
I'm actually going to turn this around.
So people would want to ask a question.
Good. Just a quick comment on Afghan refugees in Iran. There's a lot of scholarly study that's now being done by this, and there's actually going to be a conference at the Australian National University at the end of next month with a number of papers on the experiences of Afghans in Iran being delivered. Some people found themselves refugees sur place in Iran back in 1978 at the time of the communist coup, and more at the time of the Soviet invasion. That is, people who had not fled Afghanistan but perhaps gone as workers to a neighbouring country but were then unable to return because of changed circumstances in their country of nationality. And there were a significant number of those, and then a lot of people from the vicinity of Herat and from the west of Afghanistan made their way to Iran. The Iranian approach to Afghan refugees was very different from the approach in Pakistan. In Pakistan, refugees were put in long-term camps, in effect warehoused in the northwest frontier province, as it was then called. Whereas in Iran, people tended to go into transit facilities and then rapidly distribute within the Iranian population, where they encountered problems, but the opportunities were probably greater than those available to Afghan refugees in Pakistan. What we see now, of course, is people going through Iran on the way to other destinations where they hope to be able to claim asylum and secure a longer-term future. And that's also part of the explanation of the presence at any given moment of a certain number of Afghans in Iran. They're on their way through Iran towards other countries.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but no Iranians going as refugee to Afghanistan.
I wouldn't say that no one has gone.
No, you mentioned that lots of Afghani from lots of Iranian going to Afghanistan. It's vice versa. It's vice versa.
No, I think you might. There is Iranian influence in Afghanistan at the moment. If you go to Kabul, you can see universities with a particular political and religious orientation which have been funded by groups from within Iran, and you have Iranian visitors. But no, I have no evidence of any significant numbers of refugees from Iran going into Afghanistan.
Same culture, same language.
Okay, next question.
Please come up to the bar. Sorry. Yeah.
Helen from the Socialist Alliance. During the initial invasion in 2001, the Americans were offering, NATO, the US-led NATO, were offering bounties for people to hand over or give information about members of the Taliban. And these people were being tortured. So a lot of people were turning over. This is a very poor country. Yeah. Very poor country. So people were being turned over to the Americans who were probably quite innocent, some of whom may have, been accredited to certain people or an enemy of a certain individual. And the Northern Alliance were doing this quite widely. A lot of people were being tortured in Bagram Air Base. The investigative journalist Seymour Reusch, who exposed the My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, actually alleged that children were being raped in front of their parents for information about the Taliban, to extract information about the Taliban. Is Bagram Air Base still being used as a torture centre? Australian citizen Mamdouh Habib was actually tortured in Bagram, and he says that he heard women screaming under torture and children screaming under torture. Is it still being used as a torture centre by the United States?
In 2004, 2005, I was in Bagram maybe 120 days. I had the big advantage of being let out in the afternoon again. There was nobody allowed in Bagram, and people who were prisoners who were in Guantanamo said, Guantanamo was a nice place. What do we have to do to go back to Guantanamo?
Really?
Yes, yes. A very big part of the prisoners in Bagram were just very normal, simple people. Shepherds, they have never ever seen a car. They were just 20 years ago, the father took a girl from the next village, and now I know the Americans, and I tell them that you are Taliban. The Americans believed him. He was taken in, and he ended up in Bagram for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So a very high percentage of the people in Bagram were just innocent. Well, there was research done about what percentage of the people in Guantanamo were captured by the Americans or sold by the Northern Alliance to the Americans. And David Hicks was sold for $5,000 by the Northern Alliance, so we don't have to go very far. So yes, there was a lot of selling of people going on. Bagram is now still an American air base, but the prison in Bagram has been turned over to the Afghan authorities. So it's not anymore an American prison, American-run prison, it's an Afghan-run prison. And in respect to torture, well, in theory, the International Red Cross has access to all and everything, but there were quite a number of doors in Bagram which we were never allowed to enter. We, the Red Cross, were never allowed to enter. There was more torture going on in so-called forward operating bases in smaller prisons all over Afghanistan, where the International Red Cross had no access to. But when you were talking to people, to prisoners in Bagram, and they described their experience, and they didn't know exactly where they were, but if you spoke to 20 people and 19 of them told you the same story and the same description, well, what they saw, what they remember, you can assume that it was true and there was torture going on. What the situation is now, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Just on that, there is an excellent documentary, chilling documentary called Taxi to the Dark Side, which you might want to track down through YouTube, which was about the experience of an Afghan taxi driver called Dilawar, who was seized apparently on strong evidentiary grounds and ended up dead as a result of the experience. And again, when we look at the issue of torture, the mere efforts that were made by people like John Yu as legal advisors to the Bush administration to redefine torture in such a way as it would not embrace a whole range of vicious techniques should lead one to be very sceptical about any denials of what was going on in these circumstances. And in a way, the one encouraging thing is that a lot of opposition developed in the United States itself to these kinds of developments. But if you want to do damage to your reputation in a country like Afghanistan, this is a good way to do it. Oh, A Taxi to the Dark Side. And in the meantime, I've remembered the name of the author of the book on natural resources in Afghanistan, which I'll share with our colleague. It was John F. Schroeder, S-H-R-O-D-E-R. So I'm not totally gone in the head.
Thank you. You have to come to the microphone.
Hi there. This is a question to William.
Can you hear me? Okay. This is a question to William. Thanks for coming. You mentioned at the end of your talk the figure of 38 years ago. So that's back around 1978. So I think that's, as I understand it, the CIA had an operation called Operation Cyclone, which was the biggest covert operation that they ever had, and it went on for 10 years during the 80s, and that it was to do with Afghanistan, and that it provoked the Red Army to re-invade Afghanistan, and that war involved lots of proxy actors because the United States did not want to have its troops directly taking out Russian planes and helicopters, and they used Islamists who and others, and that's the basis of proxy wars that we're still having now, okay? And that's where Bin Laden got his career, okay? And are we allowed to speak about that in public?
I think that's...
Or is it still confidential?
No, there's a lot of material which is declassified about events of that particular period, and we have a much richer knowledge now than we had some time ago. I think it is partly as that narrative suggests, but there are more complexities. The principal factor which prompted the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and we now know this from declassified Soviet material which was published from 1992 onwards in the journal Vопроsi History, was not a response to American activities in Afghanistan. The Soviets were largely indifferent to that. What worried the Soviets was the elimination by one faction within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, of the then President of Afghanistan, Nur Muhammad Taraki. Taraki had visited Leonid Brezhnev on the way to a non-aligned summit in Havana and had been received as a sort of... Oh, sorry. Tareki had visited Moscow on the way to the non-aligned summit in Havana and had been received as an honoured guest, and he was then murdered by Hafizullah Amin when he went back to Afghanistan. And that seems to have been the crucial factor that tipped the Soviet leadership from a position early in 1979, which was wary of becoming involved in Afghanistan, to a position of moving to overthrow the Afghan government. And the Americans were peripheral at best in that particular set of circumstances. It was really a product of the internal tensions within the Afghan communist movement. Some years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor in the Carter administration, gave a rather boastful interview to Le Nouvel Observateur in Paris, in which he said that they had been trying to lure the Soviets into a kind of quagmire in Afghanistan. That there is actually no evidence to suggest that was the case, that the low-level assistance which Brzezinski was pushing to have given to Afghan parties in Pakistan, some of which did arrive before December 1979, had any decisive impact. And I think myself that Brzezinski was big-noting himself when he said that. Of course, as soon as the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the Americans very quickly swung into action in the area. And their great mistake at that stage was to sublet to the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate of the Pakistan Armed Forces the choice of which Afghan political parties would be the principal recipients of American assistance. And the Pakistanis, for the reasons related to the Durand Line and their relationship with Afghanistan earlier, were exceedingly reluctant to provide any support to nationalistic or secular Afghan political parties. They thought that groups like the Hezb-e-Islami of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, which were promoting a kind of global agenda of Islamic revivalism, would be much less likely to be interested in a territorial dispute like Pashtunistan than would be some of the national groups. And that was a very slippery slope as far as the Americans were concerned.
Just about Zbigniew Brzezinski, wasn't there a memo that he, when the Soviet army returned to Afghanistan, didn't he write a little note to President Carter that, yes, they've invaded, like, joyously, like they've fallen for the Afghan trap, as in there'd been a successful provocation?
Well, yes, he did, but that wasn't actually evidence of what the Soviet motivations were. The difficulty at that stage was that what exactly had driven the Soviet decision makers was quite cryptic, and the same behaviour could be explained either in grand geopolitical terms in relating to a thrust towards the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, or it could be defined much more in terms of local concerns. What we now know from the declassified Soviet documentation was that it was much more concerned with the internal tensions that had flared to the surface between different elements of the Afghan communist movement than it was with geopolitics. Of course, that wasn't apparent to outside observers at the time. It was entirely unclear what kinds of factors might have motivated the Soviet Union to invade in Afghanistan. There was just the fact of the invasion, on the strength of which people could then offer different possible interpretations of what was happening. Brzezinski's was one, George Kennan offered another, and I think neither was actually accurate. Neither really captured the internal dynamics that we now know about because of the declassified documents.
Thanks very much, John. Next question.
Frank Bevis. My idea was the idea of a federated solution to peace in Afghanistan. I was wondering what the ground of this was. Not just a very well thought through idea, no doubt, but is there any work leading up to that idea? Any confidence on the ground that you would lay bets on?
Thanks for that. I'm German, and Germany is a federal republic. And when I'm thinking of the Bavarian near the Austrian border and the people from Hamburg, And the Berliner, they are different people. They can't even understand each other when they speak their own dialect. And based on that model, I'm thinking of Afghanistan, and that's only my personal possible solution. Whether that is realistic, I have no idea. I have never heard of anybody talking about something like that. It's coming from this mind only.
Okay. I'm wondering if I can take the liberty of asking Dr. Timur Sharan, who was with us this afternoon, to share a few thoughts on this particular issue, because I know it's a very important one. Dr. Sharan is from Afghanistan, as program manager at the Asia Foundation, and his particular research is focused on network politics in Afghanistan, and I'd be interested to hear his views on whether, given the network character of politics here, a federal system is something which has much prospect of feasibility. Timur, could you?
Would he come forward?
Thank you, brother, for not putting me on the spot. I thought I was here, on holiday, but clearly not. Thank you. I think it's a very important question, and this is something that we need to discuss this in Afghanistan in a rather more serious manner. I don't think at this stage the notion of federalism is practically possible in Afghanistan, given the current power dynamics that exist in the country. But the Afghan constitution, especially the post-2001 Bonn, after Bonn conference, does talk, gives a degree of decentralization. And I think we could expand on that in a sense that we should have elections for municipalities, elections for governors, but also a district level election, which hasn't happened. Both municipality and district level election hasn't happened in Afghanistan, something that the constitution has proposed. It hasn't happened, both probably because of the issue of funding and the fact that we already have a lot of election taking place in Afghanistan political cycle. So a more decentralized system could work at this stage for Afghanistan. This is something that the president is advocating. In fact, we might have for the first time district level election with the parliamentary election that is supposedly will take place between August to October this year. But I'm afraid at this stage, practically, the concept of federalism as such is problematic in Afghan politics. There's a whole discourse of nationalism against it that says that the country will break away into several parts, and that's not feasible. So that's my response. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the two of you, Martin and William. I just have a question from Mr. William Maley. We talked about peace talk, or what we have at least going on right now. And I sort of sensed that there was, in your analysis of the situation, there was a sense of apprehensiveness in how you looked at it. Given that, because we haven't been able to deliver a diplomatic solution to the Afghan problem so far, we are seeing more and more problems, manifested in different ways, rising right now. We see that ISIS has taken hold in eastern Afghanistan. We see splinter groups within Taliban coming up, and all of this, if you're not able to deliver peace in a negotiation table, we see that these are all problems that are going to make that task further difficult for all of us. What do you think? What other alternatives are there, if not perhaps heeding to the demands of Taliban at this stage, where they're saying basically put us out, remove our name from the UN blacklist, remove the sanctions on our leaders, foreign troops leave Afghanistan, and it seems like that's what's happening. So why not given to these, what we classify as demands of the Taliban for talks? Because clearly, the way I see it, there are no other ways but talks, sitting together and as Afghans addressing these problems. Thank you very much for the talks.
I formulate my position as not apprehensive but sceptical. And the reason that I'm sceptical is that it is at least 8 years since people began talking about talks to the Taliban as the solution, and nothing has materialised. Nothing actually has materialised that amounts to substantial progress towards negotiation. And the reason for that, I think, is that there are certain prerequisites for effective negotiation which are not particularly to be found in this conflict formation. And as a professor of diplomacy, Lord knows normally I'm looking for bases on which you can negotiate outcomes. But firstly, you need to have actors that are sufficiently unified that those who sit at the negotiation table can bind a substantial number of other people with commitments that they might make. And I was in Kabul in 1998 when the UN sent a delegation to negotiate with the Taliban over the issue of humanitarian access, and it was disastrous in several respects. One was that every day a new Taliban delegation turned up for the talks, so there was no sense in which commitments that were made the previous day were held to stick. And finally, when they signed a memorandum of understanding, it contained the words, quote, "Women's access to health and education will need to be gradual." Now, it's one thing for the UN to accept that not everything is going to happen overnight in Afghanistan. It's another thing to compromise fundamental norms of which the UN is a custodian by signing a text of that kind. And this, I think, has left a lingering scepticism on the part of significant groups within the Afghan population as to whether their rights and their gains over the last 10 years might be the first thing traded away in order to do some kind of elite deal with the Taliban. Because the history of elite settlements in Afghanistan has been one in which lots of people's interests have been ignored or neglected for the sake of a piece of paper. So I think that's another problematic element that comes into play there as well. Then there's the issue of whether groups actually subscribe to a whole range of international norms. We're not actually just talking about the situation in Afghanistan. We're talking about an environment in which Afghan governments are now committed to a wide range of international norms that are potentially important. And it seems more than likely that an agreement with the Taliban could be at the expense of some of those norms, and that the Taliban themselves might not even subscribe to basic norms of negotiation like pacta sunt servanda, that when you commit yourself to an outcome you stick by it. And I think the fundamental fear that a lot of people have in Afghanistan is that the Taliban might sign an agreement and honour it only until it was in their immediate interest to violate the terms and act in a different way, at which point the interest of the wider world would have been thoroughly dissipated. So I think it's understandable that people may hope that you can use negotiations as a way of solving complex problems, but part of the difficulty is when you have exceptionally low levels of trust, which is inevitably the case when you've had 38 disturbed years in a country like Afghanistan. It's very, very difficult indeed to use negotiation processes to produce agreements which will survive the implementation phase. And not much talk is going on about this, but historically what we know from the study of peace agreements is a lot of peace agreements get signed. The problem is actually making them work on the ground. And it seems to me, at least, that the circumstances on the ground are just about as unpropitious as you could possibly wish to find in terms of implementing agreement. There are too many regional actors that are hostile to the Taliban and would look for local partners to continue to combat them. There's no particular reason at this point to think that Pakistan's interests have changed. A lot of people fear that it would simply be a Trojan horse kind of model. That I think is the fundamental concern.
Thank you. Please, your question. Your name.
Charlie Bradley. I'd like you to develop a little bit more about what we can do. I come from the educational, come from an educational interest, but about what we can do. Has the government, has Julie Bishop accepted the responsibility that you've alluded to in what we can do now? But also, what are the sorts of things that we will be able to do in the future as we, at some time, expand the foreign aid budget, cultural relations? And does the Afghani diaspora in Australia have a role to play.
There are a lot of things positively that a country like Australia could do. One of the most important areas is education, of course, and historically when I was in Kabul last year, I went to the inauguration ceremony for the AusAid Students Alumni Association with about 80 Afghan students who've done master's degrees at Australian universities. Very bright and impressive group of young people. There are good reasons why reviving scholarships for Afghan students, which is something which the Australian ambassador in Afghanistan is very keen to do, would be a good move. But frankly, I'd also like to see travel advisories which say do not travel to Afghanistan presented in a more nuanced way, because at the moment it's very difficult to send Australian university academics to Afghanistan simply because of the insurance costs, and I go anyway. And I said to the Vice-Chancellor of my university, look, if anything happens to me, it's a salary savings. Because of things like the time difference between Afghanistan and Australia, we're a very natural partner for the delivery of distance education programs and things like that. There's a lot that can be creatively done in that respect. One thing I would like to see Australia do is enhance the medical evacuation capacities of the Afghan security forces, because a friend of mine lost his young cousin about a month and a half ago in Afghanistan, who was confronting militants in Badakhshan, and he received an injury which was not particularly serious, but he froze to death before he could be medically evacuated. And the Americans used to be able to move people in sort of 10 to 15 minutes after an engagement, and they left behind nothing even remotely useful in terms of helping Afghan soldiers in the field. And if you actually look at the Asia Foundation survey, you find that there is a very high level of respect for the Afghan National Army voiced by the respondents there. They certainly see that a country is not going to be stabilised if it doesn't have an effective security force, and a lot of courageous people have enrolled in security, but I think we owe it to them that if we're asking them to sort of defend our front line against extremism, that we make contributions to ensure that if they're injured, they can somehow be rescued from those kind of environments as well. So that's another thing that we could do. But there are lots of things that could be done constructively to help Afghanistan.
On Sunday evening, when I'm going to Kabul, a lady is coming with me, an international, very well-known permaculture teacher, and she is giving in Kabul a permaculture design course. Agriculture is a big issue and an important issue. And Australia has an enormous knowledge in dryland farming. And Afghanistan is a dry country. And after this winter, with not much snow, it most likely will be even drier next year. So why do we not transfer our knowledge of dryland farming to Afghanistan?
Thank you very much. It's come to the end of the program. I think we're just past that. Do you have a question?
Just a clarification about invasion. You know, when Soviet Union went to Afghanistan, it was invasion or invitation from Barbara Khan. They opened the universities, they opened the school, and they went to, you know.
It was